I was incredibly lucky to be invited to look round the Daler Rowney art materials factory in Bracknell, and it really is a Willy Wonka kind of factory. So come with me and we'll see inside. Daler Rowney is part of the Fila group, which is Italian, but what you might not know is that in that group you've got people like Strathmore, Canson, Arsh, Princeton, Lucas, as well as things like Das, Giotto, May Mary, Lyra, Prang. I mean, just a vast range of creative arts and crafts brands. Daler Rowney was founded in 1783 by Richard and Thomas Rowney, who used to make wig powders. But when good old King George IV took his wig off, everyone else did too, and their business collapsed. So they started to make artist paints. All around the factory, there are lots of historic art materials. Back in the 1800s, they used to work with artists such as Turner developing new paints. His lovely lump of lapis lazuli, pigments, old paint sets, and such like. Here are some of the original wig powders. I can't imagine people having pink wigs, but there you go. It was fascinating to see the different sets and products. Obviously, some we recognise today. This one particularly caught my eye as a little travel set, sort of set into a bottle. Fantastic. This telegram is from the Second World War when the factory in London was bombed, and it's a telegram to the owners saying, we've lost everything. But apparently Winsor and Newton let them use their factory to produce for the rest of the war. After that spot of history, we moved into the factory, and this is the pigment store. Powders and tubs of all different colours, and the same pigment goes into their oils, pastels, watercolours and acrylics. Goes into their student range as well as their artist range. It's just that the student range has more fillers. So some of these pigments are really valuable, some less so. And we also saw where they store the resin for the acrylics. It was huge. Once the paint has been mixed to the formula, just using essentially a very large cake mixer, it goes on to milling, and it is shoveled into the milling machine, and this really releases the colour. It might go through the mill 2, 3, 4 times depending what it needs. I was really struck with how manual everything was. Literally, there was a guy shoveling red paint through the mill. And they said it's because human beings are infinitely better than machines. The paint is then stored until it's ready to go into tubes, and it does go through a whole load of different quality controls. The quality control lab was fascinating. They do various tests such as the bits test and pH and things like that, but they actually keep samples for up to 10 years, so if there's a problem they can go back to those. In the quality control lab they had lots of heritage pigments and ingredients that can no longer be used because either they're dangerous or obsolete or have been improved. Things like Indian yellow, which is the urine of cows fed on mangoes, and the bones from a mummy, and cochineal, which is beetles. Those aren't used anymore. When the paint has passed all the quality control tests, it goes onto this machine where it's put into tubes, either metal tubes, or there are other machines with the plastic tubes for things like System 3 acrylics. And they are either crimped or heat sealed, and then they go off for packing. One of the fascinating places we saw was the label store. All these reels here are different labels for different paints, because of course you need a label for every range, every colour in every range. And again, if you just look at their range of different acrylics, watercolours, oil paints, there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. So I love that label store. And I often think, oh, some of these labels are a bit old fashioned. Well, can you imagine having to update these? Well, when legislation changes or any country has new laws and you've got to put on new information. So this was just fascinating. They said this was about a third of their labels and the rest are elsewhere. The stock either is then sent off to the warehouse or goes to be made into sets. And again, this is all done manually. So they're putting in the right colours, brushes, whatever. And this is all the stock that's going to go into sets. After colour, we moved on to the surfaces, and this is where they put together all the different pads, sketchbooks, notebooks, etc. And also where they produce mountboard. I hadn't realised that St Cuthbert's Mill, which produces Saunders Waterford and Bockingford, is part of the Feeler group. So they use lots of their paper in their sketchbooks. I'm a bit of a paper nerd, so just loved this and loved looking at these huge reels of papers that were going to go into covers and mountboard and all sorts. And then they took us into this warehouse, and if you just look at the quantity of paper that's there. It was just enormous. Daler Rowney were one of the founders of the Fine Arts Guild, which sort of sets regulations for the framing industry, for the archival framing, and they produce mountboard by gluing the backing and front and the core all together here. And that's what's happening on this machine, which was really interesting. And then we moved on to watercolours in their mini factory, where exactly the same process happens on a smaller scale. So here's the mixing of watercolours, and then they are milled on a far smaller mill, and then they are either dehydrated in an oven if they're producing pans, and they produce things that they call slugs. And these blue rolls over here are watercolour slugs, and these are then sent off to the Dominican Republic to be extruded, cut up and put into watercolour sets. They do some extrusion here, just on a small scale. And in fact, they were producing some Maymery watercolours on this occasion because there was some big rush order. So the Daler Rowney factory was helping out the Maymery factory, which is all part of the same group. And you can see this is the extruded watercolours, which comes out under high pressure in these strips, and then they're all cut up. We also went on and had a look at the ink lines because I don't know if you're aware, but there are some fantastic inks. I love FW. So we went and had a quick look there. There wasn't a huge amount going on at this point, which was a shame, but there you go. So this is the ink filling line here. I guess it's quite hard to put those stoppers in because they've got the little glass pipettes. After that, we headed off into the R&D lab, and this is where they develop new formulations, new colorways, and test the interesting products that marketing have come up with. Sad to say, I didn't spot anything that surprised me, so I can't give you any gossip. After that, we were so lucky. They've got this experimentation area that they'd set up for us with millions of products. Wonderful artist Jenny Muncaster was
Colour,
there
the
to
heavy
do
bodied
various
extensive watercolour
demonstrations for
over it as
us.
well. It almost gives you that, like broken plaster, like a fresco that's crumbling away. Love that effect. And that's really... so I'm going to start off with a little bit of sky. So let's hope this is working. A little bit of cerulean blue. So I'm just going to do literally a little squiggle. Get my sponge, a little bit of water. Before that dries, is just wiggle it about. So let's get my sky in like this. And I promise you, this is exactly what I did for that big canvas that you saw in reception.
After the demonstrations, we were encouraged to have a go ourselves, and we could use pretty much anything from their range. Now, I don't use acrylics, or very little, maybe a bit in mixed media. But I really enjoyed using the System 3 and the fluid acrylics and the heavy bodied, and seeing how they worked together and how they coordinated across the range. And it's exactly the same pigment and color range, so that you could really play with texture and density. And I did enjoy that. I had a go at some sort of fluid backgrounds and stenciling with the heavy body, and then dotting with the sort of fluid pens. And yeah, really enjoyed that. I'm not a convert, but it was fascinating. I'm already a fan of FW inks, so I was interested in the System 3 inks to try and work out how they were different. And I think it was really a level of opacity that the System 3 inks, and Jenny's using one here, are more opaque, whereas the FWs are a little bit more watercolory, even though they are acrylic inks. So there were a few things that I discovered, like they do refillable acrylic markers, which is brilliant. And this is the piece that I put together. I did lots of textures, as you can see, and used gold and bronze and all sorts in it. I quite liked it in the end. Didn't really have much of a go with the oils because I was desperate to get onto watercolours, and there was a whole load of aquafine, gouache, and their artist watercolours and the different brushes for us to have a play with. I just did a sort of foliage pattern with the watercolours, because that both tested the pigments and the pigment load and how well they released, as well as the spring of the brushes. And this was a little piece I did, and it was pretty enough. The final thing that I tried was some of their pens and fine liners. So I'm a big fan of using Tombows for particularly urban sketching or plein air sketching, and I hadn't come across the Lyra brand of dual tip markers, so I was testing out how well they blend with water, and they were fantastic. So this whole experimentation process was great fun. The whole day was great fun. We actually got some lovely goodies to go home with as well, which was a huge bonus. And over the next few weeks, I'll do some reviews of those and show you what I've got and what I think.